All right, let's see if I can give this a try here. So, these are the first notes for chapter 2, which is the first section here is covering Mesopotamia, early civilizations of Mesopotamia. The worksheet that I gave you today on the geo skills here mainly was kind of talking about uh, essentially two geographical features that I need you to kind of differentiate: Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia. So, Fertile Crescent is that area stretching from the Persian Gulf to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. Like it says, we're talking what is now modern day countries of Kuwait, through Iraq, Syria, down into Lebanon, Israel, what they would refer to as Levant. The term fertile implies that this is one of the first places where we see systematic agriculture, farming start to develop. Crescent is just from the kind of half shape, that the land encompasses. Within the Fertile Crescent, you have the region that was historically known as Mesopotamia. The term is a Greek term, meaning land between the rivers or middle there. Those are between Tigris and Euphrates. Mesopotamia is strictly within what is now the modern day country of Iraq. Oftentimes they talk about Iraq being the kind of the cradle of civilization, because this is one of the first places where we refer to as a cultural hearth, where civilizations began. All right, so these are two geographical terms that you should be able to distinguish. All right, sometimes people use it interchangeably, but they're distinguishable. All right, so for example, the Fertile Crescent, light green. You see the kind of like U shape, if you will, and Mesopotamia right in there. All right, and like I said, this is some of the first places we see Neolithic settlements, coinciding with the arrival of wheat, barley, rye, cereal grains. All right. And again, for the five, what they refer to as cultural hearths, the thing they do have in common geographically is they develop around river systems. All right. Now, the first civilization to basically spring out of Mesopotamia, so to speak, would be the Sumerians. Again, debate when Sumerian civilization developed, because a lot of the kind of Sumerian city states, because Sumer is not necessarily a unified country, it's a collection of separate city states with certain cultural similarities. Probably started out as Neolithic sites and that developed into actual cities anywhere between 3000 to 3500 BC. So, like the textbook technically starts at our chapter starts at 3500 BC, but around 3000 probably is usually the contemporary thought here. All right, now the Sumerians have those characteristics that we talked about last chapter in that handout notes I sent on the 6 characteristics of civilizations. The Sumerians tended to meet those 6. All right, so the first one being that they're urbanized. All right, we start to see people again with agriculture, farming, basically being the foundation of the story. Establish permanent settlements, become Neolithic sites. With this, we start to see kind of larger populations. So this is nothing different than, let's say, Jericho or Çatalhöyük. However, it's on a larger scale. All right. So whereas like Çatalhöyük, which had the largest population, we're talking about like 6,000 people there at its peak. In these city states, we're talking probably tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. All right, with this, because they are so successful at farming, not everybody has to be a farmer. We don't have necessarily subsistence farming going on. So people diversifying the types of work that they do. All right, so we see the development of artisans and those people trading goods and services for various agricultural surpluses. Like I said, this is something similar that you would have in these Neolithic sites. However, the third factor is the thing that really separates Sumer or the Sumerians from those at Çatalhöyük and really separates prehistory from history, and that is writing. Sumerians are considered to have developed the first writing system, independent writing system. Their system of writing is referred to as cuneiform, which I believe is a Greek term, which means like a wedge-shaped writing. All right, and so the kind of cuneiform system of writing in language was probably initially a kind of what we call whole word, meaning one symbol represents a whole word, one word or idea, and then over time it kind of morphs into a combination of kind of symbols and stuff like that. Now in Sumer, they didn't have paper, all right. They wrote on clay tablets, and so what they would do is on wet clay they would basically put these indentations in something called the stylus. All right. To be literate, and remember, there's a kind of like a basically scribes are basically a class of people that make their living writing. To be literate, to probably be a scribe, then you'd probably have to know probably about 60,000 kind of cuneiform symbols and combinations thereof. So not everybody was literate. It was a very kind of like skilled, specific type of kind of skill set that you would have there. So these are some examples of some clay tablets here. The language changes over time. Initially, pretty simplistic in its imagery, and then over time, it becomes a little bit more difficult to kind of understand. So this is you see the kind of wedge shape kind of indentations there. This they believe is a clay tablet that has the recipe for beer. Sumerians developed beer. They probably drank it as a supplement to the diet. It was pretty heavy in wheat and barley and that. And so you would like in like for example, this one's a little bit more distinguishable where you see the kind of the cuneiform writing, but they believe this is a sale of real estate, right? Exchanging hands, and so you can definitely see the kind of like the wedge shape images right in there, sized. This that they believe is a image from a, and this is in the British Museum in London, a part of a clay tablet that has been lost to history, but they believe they got enough information that this was informing the king of one of the city-states, I think Kish or Lagash, that his son had died in battle. But those who study ancient languages look for patterns, all right? And so later civilizations are going to use this style of writing, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians. So they're going to use a lot of those languages to try to kind of understand Sumerian cuneiform. And the video that you guys did yesterday talks about there's a small window that we have information on, but it's enough to kind of paint a relatively accurate story, we believe. And so there's an example of a stylus. Like I said, it basically put into wet clay and you kind of had to dry. A numerical system. The Sumerians did develop the concept of 60s, like it's based on 60. So you'd have like the 60-second minute, 60-minute hours developed by the Sumerians. Numbers, though, as time goes on, you see like the numbers kind of developing into they almost look like golf tees, basically just kind of arranged. All right. I was going to have you guys do a assignment where you inscribe your initials in cuneiform on Play-Doh, but thanks to COVID, we're going to skip over that. All right. Now, another thing that the Sumerians had that would classify them as civilization is advanced technology. Technology, in the sense, is not necessarily computers or telephones, right? But it's just basically kind of inventions or things that basically improve upon life. The big invention that's associated with the Sumerians is the wheel. Right, initially used for pottery purposes, but then somebody decided to put it on a cart, and it's revolutionary, right? Changes the way man gets around. The plow, more importantly, the plow and how it was used. In the term of metals, we start to see the development of bronze, which mixes copper and tin, make it stronger for tools and weapons and such, ushering in what we call the Bronze Age. All right, so we went from kind of like the Stone Age to like more of a kind of a Copper Age and then Bronze. All right, so the Sumerians were one of the first civilizations to use bronze to their advantage. Not every place comes to the Bronze Age at the same time. Egypt comes to it a little bit later, but the use of metals is a definite advancement in technology. And then the development of complex institutions, which we had mentioned, like government, religion, and stuff like that. In many cases in the ancient world, government or political power and religion go hand in hand. Religion becomes justification for the rule of kings and emperors and stuff like that. Excuse me. In Sumer, what you would see in a lot of city-states, this kind of relationship between civics and religion in the kind of like physical manifestation in these structures called ziggurats, which were temples that were used for religious and political ceremonies and such. Every major Sumerian city-state had a ziggurat at the center of it. You knew you were in the presence of greatness. Right. There's two ziggurats or remains of ziggurats that are left standing in Iraq. This is the most famous one. That's the ziggurat of Ur, which the video talked about as being the birthplace of Abraham. It probably had maybe 3 to 4 levels. Again, that's kind of inherent in man's DNA to kind of build up to the heavens. But they use this for public purposes, whereas like the pyramids that we'll talk about next week are used strictly for the tombs of pharaohs. All right, they're not public spaces. Also, too, it's important that this is left standing. It's not stone. This is made of mud bricks. All right, which there wasn't very many stone quarries in Iraq, which still isn't today. All right. Also, too, religiously speaking, all right, and we'll talk about a lot of these civilizations. We'll talk about their mythologies, their belief systems. Like 99.9% of all ancient cultures, the Sumerians are polytheistic. They believe in many different deities, many gods. The world was just too complicated a place for one god or one deity to kind of control everything. All right, that just kind of is like kind of inherent in a lot of these ancient cultures, and so with this, you have the triad religion used as a way to kind of explain the unexplainable. Every culture has a creation story. All right, for the Sumerians, their creation story was with the utterance of one word, and initially there was a primordial sea. That sea gave birth to An or Anu and Ki. All right, the god of heaven and the goddess of earth. They are in like many cultures, brother and sister as well as husband and wife. They have offspring. Their two important sons, Enlil, who's the god of air, was associated with the north winds that would kind of cool in the summer evening. But Enlil is important for basically separating Ki and Anu, and to basically kind of create the earth as far as like terrain, as well as shaping and basically creating man. And essentially, in the creation story, human beings were basically made of clay, and we're basically for the entertainment of the gods. And then his brother Enki, or A, is associated with the rivers as the god of floods, and floods are necessary evils in ancient cultures. You need the floods to come to replenish the soil. All right, and so in this sense, these were the creation deities. All right, they're the kind of first tier of gods and goddesses. This is an image here of Enki, the god of floods and water here, with two streams emanating from his shoulder. You see fish in there. Thus represents the Tigris and the Euphrates. This deity up here is part of the second tier of deities, so they're referred to as the sky gods. Right? And there's three major sky gods. Nana, who's the god of the moon, the ziggurat of Ur that I showed you the image was dedicated in his honor. Most of those ziggurats and most of the Sumerian city-states were dedicated to particular gods. It's these gods that get the most amount of dedication to them. Utu, who is a sun god, later is going to be, for the Babylonians, referred to as Samesh and associated with laws. And then the quintessential female deity is Inanna, the queen of heaven, goddess of love, war, procreation, so on and so forth. She has probably the most amount of stories related to her of the three. And in a sense here, her stories are a way for a patriarchal, male-dominated society to try to explain the irrational nature of women and try to kind of relegate women to kind of second-class citizenry to a certain extent. There's one story in which one of her husbands, a guy named Dumuzi, who was a king as well as a demigod, was banished to the underworld by her for not giving her enough attention, and he could only return during the planting and harvesting season. And that was a way for the Sumerians to explain the concept of seasons to a certain extent. All right. She's more famously known by her Babylonian name, which is Ishtar, which if you in Babylon during the Chaldeans, when you entered into the kind of the city, you passed through what they call the Ishtar gates. But there's some similarities with her and Aphrodite and Venus. Like her planet is usually associated with the planet Venus. All right. But like I said, a lot of times religion and politics go hand in hand. A number of kings were also priests. So you would have the priest-king kind of concept developed in Sumer. That starts to kind of break down a little bit more, and we see separate kind of entities of kings and priests. But there is a list, thanks to the writing, of various Sumerian kings of various city-states. Now, some of them, like I mentioned, Dumuzi, are told in kind of a mythological kind of like sense. The one king where we see like him being written about while he was ruling is the king of Kish by the name of Etana. So that's why they refer to him as the first ruler of a historical record. All right. In many cases, they often refer to him as the man who stabilized the lands, but we're not totally sure what that exactly means. There could have been a civil war, or it could have he just basically led Kish to be the dominant city state through military might, if you will. All right. But there is a list of other kings from other city states roughly at that same time, a little bit after as well. But he's the first one where we have a list of, him being written about while he was governing, if you will. All right. Another Sumerian king is actually not Sumerian, but from a people referred to as the Akkadians, who were a Semitic people, somewhat distant cousins to what we classify as Hebrews, probably, right, that had their origins in Syria. But Sargon, as they known as Sargon the Great, is credited as establishing the first empire. So he is going to take over these city states of Sumer, allow for many kings to maintain their title of kingships, but they pay tribute to him. And so at one point, this area is referred to as Sumer and Akkad. It's the first time it's kind of unified. The city of Agade, sometimes spelled Akkad with a K, was founded by him and became the capital of this region, essentially. So later, Assyrian kings are going to take the name Sargon, looking back in history. All right. So he is one of these figures that, while he's a conqueror, he's also kind of understands the culture that he is essentially incorporating, is a little bit more older and probably as important, or if not more important. So the Akkadians start to write in cuneiform. They worship a lot of the main deities. They kind of integrate into Sumerian culture. The language of cuneiform starts to change a little bit with their influence, but the general histories have Sargon and the Akkadians as basically almost like kind of de facto Sumerians, if you will. So this is an image here of Sargon, a famous bust that has his eye knocked out for whatever reason. And this here is in green is basically the empire of Sargon and the Akkadians, all right, which they kind of ruled from about 2300 up until about 150 years or so, establishing a few dynasties. All right. Now, after the Akkadians, we see another group of outsiders, because this was an area that had been attractive, particularly for various cultures who were kind of raiding and pillaging, if you will. Some would leave, some would stay. All right, the Gutians were one of those that would stay. However, the histories about them are not as flattering as they are to the Akkadians. The Gutians are probably from what is like Turkey, Iran, and that area across the Zagros Mountains. I said belligerent there because they're basically often referred to as being uncivilized. Some historians refer to this as the Sumerian Dark Ages. So for about 90 years, the Gutians dominated this region, with the exception of the city-state of Lagash, in which there's a king there named Gudea that sometimes referred to him as defeating the Gutians. In reality, he just basically kind of prevented the Gutians from subjugating the city. It was later the combined forces of the kings of Uruk and Ur that they believe actually overthrew the Gutians. But the Gutians is a prime example where we see history can be manipulated. It's based on who was writing it. So the Gutians, we don't know, have had a written language. There was no evidence of that. There's even some people that believe that the Kurds who are in northern Iraq may have some aspects of the Gutians. That's debatable, all right? But in either way, the people that are writing about them are the ones who are being subjugated. So the Gutians don't generally have a decent history per se. All right, because history can be manipulated. It's based on who is writing it. However, Gudea, as a result of his kind of defiance here, has a number of statues dedicated to him. They were able to basically be maintained. The Louvre in Paris has 16 alone, and they just basically show they write about his, in cuneiform, his conquest, if you will. So those are a few of the kings that you might need to know, or should at least know. Also, too, the development of a kind of class system that all these ancient civilizations develop, and usually a class system is based on the type of work that you do. Now, at the top, there are kings and priests, which at one point, they're one and the same. Eventually, I believe it was like the third dynasty of the city-state of Ur, we start to see that separation. All right. Below them are the wealthy merchants. The second highest class are the ones who are basically, selling the items and that from those who are artisans. Then within that you have, and that's the largest class, artisans, farmers, scribes. And then the lowest of the low in any ancient culture is slaves. Slavery is as old as civilization itself. Generally in Sumer, people became slaves through military conquest, or through in what we call indentured servitude. There were people that would volunteer either themselves or their family members to work off debts. All right, so like I said, slaves are usually the lowest of the low. All right, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the Babylonians, in the sense that um, laws are definitely different based on your class. All right, so I'll talk about that on Thursday. And then also, too, the Sumerians are kind of credited with development of kind of literature. All right, the first what we classify epic story is attributed to the Sumerians with the story of Gilgamesh, which was mentioned in the video. Um, Gilgamesh is this kind of mythological king, again, in those list of kings like kind of Dumuzi, who through the story, um, like starts out as a kind of a awful king, and the gods are going to basically punish him by sending this kind of half man, half beast named Enkidu. They engage in a battle, and it's a draw. So real recognize real. They go on basically a kind of a journey together. It's your quintessential kind of hero's journey, if you will. The big thing about this, and the story kind of jumps around a little bit, but Gilgamesh meets the survivor of a great flood, which is similar to the story of Noah, right? And then there's a story of a kind of a Garden of Eden, if you will, called Dilmun, where there's a serpent that protects this kind of flower, right? So the video was talking about how there's some stories in the Old Testament, like the story of Adam and Eve, Noah, and that may have had their origins in Mesopotamia, because Hebrew Jewish scribes, when they're in captivity later by the Chaldeans in Babylon, probably would hear these stories. And so when the Bible becomes an official text during this time, they're going to probably basically include some of these stories, because they're pretty interesting stories, into these morality tales, if you will. All right. And so the kind of the epic. So Gilgamesh then gives us basically the foundation for things like the Iliad and the Odyssey, which give us foundations for like Star Wars or whatever. All right, it's the quintessential hero's journey. Okay. All right. So that's the notes for today. All right. Let's hopefully see if this recorded, and you can use this to fill out your notes.